I would like to welcome all of you to the first in our series of events celebrating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. My name is Laura Ingwell, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology, and just one of the many people who've worked diligently to bring you this week-long celebration. A special thank you for Carmen Morrow for her leadership, and Dr. Pam Morris and the Office of Multicultural Programs for supporting this program. This year, we've put together a series of events centered on the theme of exploring environmental justice. We are so thankful to be joined today to kick off our event with Jacqueline Patterson. Jackie has dedicated her career to intersectional approaches to systems change. If you read her biography, it is clear that she is dedicated to social justice. She served as the senior director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program for over a decade, and recently founded the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. The Chisholm Legacy Project is inspired by the life and legacy of Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman in Congress and the first woman and African-American to seek the nomination for president of the United States from one of the two major political parties. Please join me in welcoming Jacqueline Patterson. And just some etiquette, please keep your microphones muted so as to not interrupt the keynote presentation. If you do have questions, please feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand, and Carmen and myself will facilitate those at the end. Thank you again for attending, and let's please give Jackie our undivided attention.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Sorry about my little technical glitch at the beginning there, but it's great to join you all. And so, yeah, and I just applaud you for having this conversation and at this time when it really is the most ideal time to be talking about how we take action on environmental and climate justice, and particularly under the theme of Martin Luther King's beloved community and his call to consciousness around racial justice, social justice in general. So I have a few slides, and I'm going to try to play this a video clip for us, but if that doesn't work, we'll see. I don't know if we mentioned that I'm in Costa Rica, actually taking an immersion Spanish course, and so we'll see how the Wi-Fi goes for us, but we'll give it a try. So here we go. Too many windows open, so navigating down to the right one. Okay, good. So as we all know, Dr. Martin Luther King speaks about this notion of, oops, trying to make it bigger and actually disappeared. Okay, he speaks about this notion of the beloved community, and the beloved community being defined by a community where people feel love for each other, people feel loved in the community, and the community is one that inspires pride, and it provides all that we need to thrive. So let's see, this live transcription thing is over. Okay, good. So I want to just get us started with this video where community really talks about their lived realities in their community. And I'll be watching, and Laura or Carmen, I can see you. So if you just kind of look, make a signal if this isn't coming across, we'll see how it goes. So here we go. I forgot I have to exit out of the PowerPoint for you to see. Stop share. Share again. All right. So here we go. Okay, good.
The city of Baytown is made of old money, lower to middle class families, and pollution. But if you get a job at a chemical plant, you don't have time to think of a solution. I guess my brother, my uncle, And my cousins are sellouts because they went industrial instead of the drug route. Refinery city lights and pipes run along the Gulf Coast, smoke roast with sulfur air. It's a wonder. Anyone's able to take a breath. We're so used to it, we forget. Soon, the sons and daughters won't be able to drink the water. They say the first priority is the people. The people are the ones being excluded and uprooted. Just ask Archie Coins, ask George Washington Carver Elementary, or ask suburban kids. Exxon Sacrifice, AKA Brownwood neighborhood. God bless social media, but Flint ain't the only case of complexion without protection. Baytown, AKA Dirty Bay, is surrounded by giant toxins, threatening the city in every way. We see the huge still from our window sills, make jokes as we choke. We've been possibly dying from this kind of poison oak. It's no mystery that the Black and brown communities are being targeted. Black Lives Matter, but not when they're expendable and making money is good for the market. Give them a fine, it's fine. They can afford it. We live with the headaches, the shortness of breath, the watery eyes. They keep building, pay for it, constantly trying to heal ourselves and repel the environmental destruction. Breathe it in. Breathe out.
Okay, so let me make sure that this closes out altogether. Oh yeah, before it starts again. Okay, so that the irony of that video is that it was made, I think, in 2016, 2017. So the fact that people were wearing the masks and the gloves, it had nothing to do with COVID. It's the reality of what our communities have been living with far before the air became unsafe to breathe for the rest of the world, and the surfaces became unsafe to touch for the rest of the world. And that's been the lived reality of many of our communities for too long. So that always strikes me when I show this video, is that it really shows that some might think of the COVID situation as an equalizer, but it really just it brings even more peril to communities that were already unequally in peril. So I'm going to continue through. So when we talk about the beloved community, as we said before, this notion of a community that has, where people are thriving, as you see in these images, people are together, people have a sense of connection, of oneness, people are celebrating just the joie de vivre, the joy of life. And for too many communities, we are very far from that. When we talk about the racial justice history and I see a chat message. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any challenges. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. So were people having trouble seeing the video? Is that what we're saying?
It just had a delay and it was kind of
Okay.
really choppy. So if you want to send that link or something to maybe Laura or myself later, or have your assistant do it, we can get it out to everybody.
Okay, great. Yes. So yes, so with the historical context that our communities find ourselves in, it's one that is rooted in this rampant extraction and exploitation of human and natural resources, that from the kind of manifest destiny and the beginnings of this place that we now call the United States of America, and how, contrary to often the romanticized notions of explorers coming and seeking new lands and so forth, it was really an extraction agenda that brought people to these lands, and it was an extraction, a violent extraction methodology that they advanced to then take these lands. And so one of the reasons that we often talk about the unceded territory that each of us sit on is because there is this, they need to acknowledge the fact that the land that most of us sit on in the United States, and what's now called the United States of America, was land that was taken from the original inhabitants, and it was never rightfully belonging to the folks who are on it now. And so when we talk about the extraction of the land, and also the extraction of people in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, and the extraction of people from sub-Saharan Africa to be brought over to be enslaved labor. And even this whole term, resources, human resources, natural resources, it's out of an extractive economy analysis that humans and nature is something to be used as a resource. It's kind of rooted in this extractive notion. And so we see how that's been institutionalized via trade, manufacturing, finance, labor policies, and lack thereof in terms of regulations that benefit the corporations that industrialize nations while being at the expense of human rights and our the earth. And so as we think about where we are, we know that there's certain communities that don't have equal access to clean air, to clean water, to uncontaminated lands, to safe and healthy foods, to shelter, and all of these things that should be basics, especially in this world of plenty, and not to mention the land of plenty. There is this kind of false narrative around scarcity, when really we really live in abundance. The problem is the hoarding of the resources by a select few that makes it gives the illusion that there is scarcity, but when in fact there really isn't. And so this is a quote from Martin Luther King. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. And again, that is the very basis of the extractive economy where we're sitting. And so as I'm going to kind of go through, because there's some, there's a lot of slides and only so much time. So I want to make sure we do have enough time to go. So with this circumstance that we're in with the extractive economy, we have this violation of our human and civil rights rampantly throughout, in terms of right to self-determination, work conditions, highest standard of physical and mental health, and so forth. And some of the things that I'll be talking about kind of illustrate just the extent to which these rights are being violated by our extractive economy. So as, again, Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So the Flint water crisis is an illustration of how the underregulated pollution, because of, again, the commandeering of our regulatory system, our legislatures, by people who have financial interest in seeing things go a certain way. So they will ensure that we don't have regulations. Like the list of toxic substances for the United States is so much shorter than other countries, because groups like the trade associations like the American Chemical Society and others have fought to keep toxins out of the list of toxic substances. Then we have a lack of investment so that we actually have monitoring and enforcement of the regulations that do exist. So it allows this under-regulation of pollution. And then we have combined in this with the extractive economy, the disinvestment in certain communities means that communities have a value to communities based on how much is being disinvested, how much is the value they can give from extractive forces, developers and otherwise, who are trying to to extract from communities, but via these investments, so to speak. And so when a community no longer has that profit value, then there is that disinvestment that takes place. And therefore, in Flint, what happened was, as a result of this, when that disinvestment happened in one fell swoop, as people went towards globalization and manufacturing overseas, then the community didn't have the resources that were necessary just to do the very basics in the community. And the democracy was then displaced as a result, because they imposed this emergency financial manager law. So when we talk about the commons and the sacrifice zones, there are certain communities that are as Martin Luther King said, taking necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. So everyone else has these, the folks who are kind of just even trying to survive with the commons are denied even those basics. And they're actually being sacrificed for the excesses of the wealthy few. So as we talk about the energy system, this is the Cesar Chavez High School in Houston, Texas, and that oil refinery behind them is one of 10 oil refineries within a 5-mile radius of that school, which is largely Latino and African-American students who are in that school. So they're the ones who are suffering from the unhealthy conditions resulting from this. This picture was taken by the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. We know about the BP oil drilling disaster that happened and now quite a few years ago, where the folks were contaminated, the waters were contaminated by the oil from BP. And even now the Gulf has not returned to wellness after that happened. We also know that 76,000 coal miners have died of black lung disease since 1968, while the National Mining Association, the trade associations for these mining companies, fought against the regulations that would have protected them from coal mine dust. And so this, again, is the very nature of the extractive economy. People will do whatever it takes to hold on to money and power and sacrifice the workers who have built our energy infrastructure in so doing. We see where vistas are also destroyed, homes are damaged from the mountaintop removal and the blasting that happens, and how it actually damages the foundations of homes. Whole species of fish have been killed off from the coal ash getting into the water systems in some of these communities, all again at the pursuit of power and luxuries for the few. When we think about the cradle to grave, we talked about the coal mining and the challenges for the miners. Also the combustion of coal through the coal-fired power plants happens in communities that are most likely to be BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and also low-income communities as well. And so the toxins that come out of those smokestacks are disproportionately being experienced by these communities. And then even on the other side of that cradle to grave, in terms of the coal ash that ends up in the waterways, and again, under-regulated. So we had what happened with the Kingston, Tennessee Valley coal ash spill, where even there was so much coal ash and so powerfully disrupted by the spill that it actually destroyed homes nearby, not to mention getting into the waterways. Yet at the same time, even as we're doing all of this to generate energy, again, the people who are using the energy most are the companies, one data center for Microsoft uses as much data as some small nations in one data center that's in one area. And so then on the other side, we have communities that are most likely to be host to these coal-fired power plants, oil refineries, the places where they're generating energy, are also the most likely to get their utilities shut off. And so these are communities where people have compounded poverty and for various reasons, and they have their utilities shut off, and to deadly impacts. We did a report, the report Lights Out in the Cold was done when I was at the NAACP, and it told story after story. A guy, a father of 5 children who had their energy shut off for non-payment, and he went and got a generator, but then he was afraid that the generator might get stolen, so he brought it inside. And so the carbon monoxide killed the entire family in their sleep. We know even of that recent situation in Philadelphia where the space heater resulted in the deaths of so many people in the families, including children. And that has happened time and time again. Candles being used when electricity is turned off again, resulting in fires that burn down homes. One of the folks, when I was doing one of these presentations, one of the people was a trauma-informed nurse, and she had a child who came in to her clinic because he tried to commit suicide after his home burned down, and then he blamed himself because the home burned down because when their oil had been cut off for non-payment, and their house was cold, his mom put the space heater in his room to keep him warm. So he blamed himself for the fact that the house burned down. So these are the kind of, again, tragic stories in a land of plenty, where it should not be that when you have CEOs of these same companies making on average $9.8 million, and you have people literally paying the price of poverty, not being able to pay a couple of $60 bills with their very lives, adults and children. So as we think about our waste system, the waste from the BP oil spill went disproportionately in BIPOC communities, and the waste included, the BP oil spill waste included berms and other things that were soaked in Corexit. And Corexit is a chemical that's banned in 90 countries. Again, not banned in the US because of the power of the chemical lobby that will allow something that's banned in 90 countries to go into landfills that are just cited for household waste. Something that's considered to be toxic by 90 countries is cited to go into a landfill it's going into a landfill that's cited for just like paper towels and toilet paper rolls and et cetera, et cetera. So this is the kind of, and the people who are in on the front lines of being impacted by this are, again, BIPOC communities and low-income communities that are host to these landfills that are more likely to be located in these communities. And we all know that landfill liners are not infinite. And so when landfill liners erode and the stuff from those landfills gets into the water supply, it's BIPOC communities and low-income communities that are drinking that contaminated water. And I think I have another story around that coming up. So whether it's landfills or incinerators, again, disproportionately located in BIPOC communities and low-income communities to the detriment of the health and well-being of the communities. And so as we think about, I'm not going to show you that video just because of time and also because you didn't get to see it very well before. So, but we'll make sure you get all these links afterwards. So even as we think about our food systems, the way that we are generating food is also kind of built on this notion of an extractive economy. So, whether it's confined animal feeding operations, where there are these kind of barbaric conditions for animals, but also not healthy for the communities that are surrounding. This is where we have these challenges around how we're doing this. So it's one thing in terms of the amount of methane that's produced from these large operations, but the sheer volume and the way it's all handled is also both, again, barbaric for animals and harmful for human and planetary health. If we looked towards doing, to the extent that we're having these types of farms and so forth, then we need to be thinking about small scale farming in order to prevent these types of large-scale issues. And then we have groups like Monsanto, which I think now has been bought by Bayer, but that developed these terminator seeds that have single cycle seeds that really that really go against the very laws of nature. And Vandana Shiva has done a lot of studies about how she's tying some of the challenges around farmers who those terminator seeds can be viral. They blow from kind of the farms that they're operating onto the farms of folks nearby, and then ends up taking over those farms, so that those farms were generating crops from regenerative seeds now have these single cycle seeds that have taken over, and then they're dependent on having to buy Monsanto seeds every year because their seeds have been crowded out. Their regenerative crops have been crowded out by these single cycle crops. So these are kind of things that we certainly don't hear of on CNN or on our local news, but this is the reality of how even some of our food is being produced and who's being impacted as a result. So we see this happening to such an extent that farmers in India were committing suicide as a result. And then our water supply, this Red Dog Mine, talk about acting with impunity. They violated the Clean Water Act. And then at the time of this article, it was more than 600 times. Now it's 800 times and counting the number of times that they violated the Clean Water Act. And as the person said in the video that we saw, give them a fine, it's fine. Because if they're allowed, in the human world of people, it's, we have all these 3 strikes rules, but they're allowed to contaminate this waterways 800 plus times, and they just get a hand slap and they just continue on. And yet on the other end, we have people, again, it's opposed to being about the abundance of water, a world that's 2/3 water, as Martin Luther King says in his speech around where do we go from here, chaos or community. We have the waters that we have being controlled through increasing water privatization, and the water that we have being poisoned with impunity by entities like the operators of the Red Dog mines. And then on the other hand, you have people having their water shut off for non-payment, again, because of how our water systems are set up, not to celebrate and embrace the abundance, but to allowing polluters and allowing privatization. So even as we talk about transportation and goods movement, the people who are living next to near roadway air pollution more likely to be BIPOC communities, low-income communities, low-income communities, and so forth. Whether it's transportation on roadway transportation or shipping channels, often are most often located in BIPOC and low-income communities. And again, the health impacts of shipping, the near roadway air pollution has been well studied, and now they're just starting to do the studies to confirm what we already knew in terms of the health risk of shipping pollution. Then we put all this together in terms of the actual health impacts, this between air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination, all of this coming into our bodies, causing myriad challenges, and again, more likely to be in BIPOC communities and low-income communities. This is one situation where the water supply was contaminated by a landfill that had the liner eroded. And so in this situation, trichloroethylene, a known carcinogen, got into the water supply of this community. And they didn't know it until people started turning up with all these cancers and birth challenges. And then they started to look into it, like, why is this happening? Why is it only happening to these families? When other families are also getting water from a similar supply. And then they looked into it and found out that 3 years before, like this one person, Sheila Holt Orsted, 3 years before, she went home when her father was dying, and she was wondering about seeing this pattern of death in that family and in her family. And she herself was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was a weightlifter, health fanatic, and so forth. I was trying to figure out what was going on. And then she started to look into county records because it was just so odd, the pattern of mortality and sickness in her family homestead, where they have multiple homes for multiple family members all clustered together. And then she found that the water supply had been contaminated when the landfill liner had eroded. And so they found out that they had sent letters to the white families informing them that the water supply had been contaminated and that they needed to drink an alternate form of water. But 3 years later, they hadn't sent any letters to the Black families at all. They had even put the animal shelter on an alternate form of water for all that time. And the Black families weren't even told that this was an issue. So for all those years, they were drinking trichloroethylene, a known carcinogen and other forms of toxins that were in the water and had no idea. And they paid the price with their lives, with the health of their babies and so forth. So these are the kind of stories of just blatant environmental racism that makes the work that we do so important. To try to really raise awareness of this and to change our systems from this extractive economy that's at the root of these challenges. We have families like this family in the Four Corners region out west, where that coal plant behind them is one of 4 coal-fired power plants within a 30-mile radius of where they live. But the irony is that those 2 coolers are on their porch because they, like 70% of the people on this Navajo land, do not have electricity or running water, while these 4 coal-fired power plants surround them and they're drinking, they're taking in the toxins from those 4 coal-fired power plants that are going to fund Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles. Las Vegas, which lights up with such excess that you can actually see it from space. Meanwhile, these communities don't even have the basics. So it's the classic kind of necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. Like you really couldn't get that more acutely than that situation. And then not only do they have the person in the picture died of a respiratory illness, so they wanted to really gift us with this photo to tell this story. The children in the family have asthma. They were worried about their family member to your left who is pregnant, and they know mercury comes out of these smokestacks. There's no men in the photo because the Navajo Nation welcomed these plants onto the land, the leaders anyway, not necessarily the communities, but the leaders did because they saw tax resources and they also saw jobs that they could promise to their communities. But when they came in with promises of a certain number of jobs, but then there were people in the jobs and there were fewer jobs than they promised. So the men in this photo, they aren't off working at the plant there. They're off in other states and only get to come home every few weeks or months because they have to work elsewhere because there's no work to be found on their lands. So in every way, these communities are facing extraction and are paying the price for the excesses while they themselves don't even have access to the very basics. This is a child of the medicines of a child named Antoine. His parents sent me the picture of his medicines and a picture of him looking while another child is playing in the fountain and where he doesn't get to play like other kids. And they really talked about how because of his asthma, he lives 2 miles away from a coal-fired power plant. Because of his asthma, he can't play like other children. Because of his asthma, he can't count on breathing without those medicines that they get for him. Because of his asthma, he can't go to school like other kids on poor air quality days. And so they really wonder what that means for his future. And then we also know that kids are having a hard time paying attention in school when they're near these coal-fired power plants because of the toxins that come out, including lead, which is known to be connected to ADHD. Then when they're not even able to go to school when with the asthma situation and many of the kids, there's 2 to 3 times, African-American children are 2 to 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack and 3 to 5 times more likely to enter the hospital from an asthma attack than white American kids. And then on top of it all, we also know that if you're living next to a toxic facility, on average, your property values are at least 15% lower. And we know that property values are what funds school systems, so that we have under-resourced school systems on top of it all. So if you're not able to go to school like other kids, you have a hard time paying attention in school, and then you have an under-resourced school system, then the ability to stay on grade level is compromised, and therefore, if you're not on grade level by the 3rd grade, studies show that you're more likely to enter into the school to prison pipeline. And this is how we see these issues as intersectional. It's just not, kind of about flora and fauna in terms of environment, or just not in terms of, the negative health impacts, but then it bleeds out into all, other aspects of one's life and well-being. So this is just a few situations where the Flint water crisis, the Alabama mercaptan oil spill, the East Chicago, Indiana lead and arsenic crisis, all of those share in common that it was low-income communities, BIPOC communities. And then we can compare it to the Porter Ranch gas leak, that within weeks it was cleaned up, and within less than a year, they're paying out $4 million in settlement. Whereas with these other communities, the situation went on for years and years, and in the cases of East Chicago, Indiana, decades, and they haven't even seen a fraction of any kind of settlement for what has taken place. So we see the racial dimensions of this and the class dimensions of this. So then on top of it all, these same facilities and practices also are connected to climate change. So, and then of course, the same communities are often impacted as well. When we have communities that are more likely to get food from a corner store than from a grocery store, much less a farmer's market. And then we have the shifts in agricultural yields that are connected to climate change, and that only makes a bad situation worse. So people are more likely to get foods from a store where the products are high in sodium, high in preservatives, high in sugars. Things are not only not good for you in terms of not containing the minerals, the vitamins, the nutrients that we need to sustain and thrive, but also foods that are actively bad for us in terms of foods that are leading to diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and so forth. My friend who is white, she said her child came home from school one day and asked her, "Mom, why are all the Black kids rich?" And so she's like, "Why do you think that, Milo?" And she's like, "Well," he said, "well, at lunch they have like Cheetos and Doritos and Fritos, and the white kids tend to have like, carrots and celery and peanut butter." And so he's looking enviously at their lunch offerings and thinking that his is pretty bad by comparison, when the irony, we both kind of laughed and cried at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, it was just like the innocence of youth. But yet at the same time, when we think about what the long-term implications are for those kids who are bringing those foods and only have access to those foods. When someone No, I can't. Someone have host powers. Okay. I think it's
Armin, can you mute that person?
Yeah.
All right. So then, then the disasters, of course. So we all know that disasters themselves don't discriminate, but how vulnerable one is to the disasters because of the infrastructure in one's community, and then how one is impacted on the other end because of, pre-existing social vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities, and even kind of access to recovery resources are all kind of critical factors. And then included in that is what kind of risks there are that exist in communities, including toxic facilities. In Port Gibson, Mississippi, this Grand Gulf nuclear station, the sirens were going off after they had tornadoes and flooding one year. And there was a concern that it would be breached. And when the nuclear reactor was built in the first place, the community was concerned because they knew about other communities where infant mortality rates rose when nuclear reactors went online, particularly in Black communities. And when I went there, I was struck because I went and visited a couple of I visited one church that had tried to set up a shelter because so many people were displaced by the flooding. And then I found the Red Cross folks and other communities I had visited that were impacted by this kind of rash of flooding and tornadoes. They had like full disaster recovery centers and like community centers or gymnasiums of schools. But when I saw the little disaster recovery operations, it was like 2 Red Cross workers in front of City Hall, like with a card table and 2 chairs. And I was like, oh, what's happening here? Why do you have such a disparity? And they said, well, we have a rule that we can't set up and even offer services like the shelter services to a community that's within 7 miles of a nuclear reactor. And so that wasn't like a discredit to Red Cross, but it really just says that if even they can't set up disaster services within, then communities certainly shouldn't be living that close to harm's way in the first place, you know? And so they set that up as a kind of protection for their workers and for their well-being, and that's reasonable. What's not reasonable is the fact that there's communities there in harm's way in the first place. And so these are the kind of built-in injustices and the lack of, again, like the rules go to the developers or go to big oil or big nuclear in this case, instead of going to protecting the well-being of the people, because it's not one of those situations where communities move in after the nuclear reactor is built. Then the community was there and the nuclear reactor was built on top of it. So, and then we see what we were talking about before in terms of transportation, those same communities that are more likely to be impacted by near roadway air pollution or shipping channel are also less likely to have access to their own transportation or even have access to the transportation that's going through their communities. And so we see how that then intersected with people's ability to be able to escape during Hurricane Katrina. And that was often attributed to much of the mortality that happened there. And so this is a striking image in that, you know, the rescuers are 4 white men, and the people that need to be rescued are largely women and children, with also the African-American male there as well. And so these are the kind of images that kind of tell the story of these disparities. And then the prison situation is kind of one compounded situation over another. We know the prison industrial complex has incarcerated a disproportionate number of Black males and Black females as well. And when the disaster came, the deputies abandoned their post, left people there, whether sewage tainted waters rose, people didn't have access to food or drink, people didn't even have the proper level of air to breathe in terms of ventilation, because they're in this kind of almost vacuum sealed cells. So they actually dug holes in the walls just to be able to get air. So and we're seeing the continued extremes. We saw just last week with the snow, and there's another system coming through, and you know, the people who are stuck on the highway for 20 hours, all of these challenges that are happening as the weather continues to be extreme. And then with the rising sea levels, we have communities that are being inundated. We have countries that are like the Maldives up in the upper right-hand corner, where they actually had a cabinet meeting underwater in 2009 to illustrate internally into the world that that's where they're going to be. At that point in 20 years, now it's less than 10 years. So this is the kind of situation. And they're actually talking to places like the Solomon Islands, negotiating with them to move their entire populace to another landmass because theirs is no longer going to be inhabitable imminently. And we're having the same situation in the US in southern Louisiana, in Kivalina, in Alaska, in Norfolk, Virginia, and so forth and so on. And so one NOAA official said that today's flood is going to be equal to tomorrow's high tide. So so flooding is just going to be so normative, it'll be kind of the equivalent of a high tide, which happens just every time the moon, with the flowing and ebbing of the moon. So we have inequities in response in terms of the disasters, whether it's, you know, the sheltering systems, or inequity in response in terms of the global response, where the Philippines, the head of the delegation for the Philippines came to the UN climate talks and was actually in tears as he spoke to the more powerful industrialized nation delegates, because his land at this particular UN climate talks, it was right after her super typhoon Haiyan. So his land was in tatters, his people were dying. And he was there trying to negotiate with these powerful nations to try to make some level of commitment, because it was these nations that are emitting all of the fumes that are causing climate change in the first place. So he broke down as he tried to plead with them to do the right thing. No one should be in that position. We should all see ourselves in a global community and equally responsible for the well-being of us all. So this is another image that struck me from another disaster after Hurricane Katrina. This is another one years later where there were tornadoes and floods, and this is in Alabama. And it struck me because I was inside the feeding center and just taking this picture at this moment where all the people who were receiving the food were African American, and all the people that were giving the food were white American. And it just struck me in terms of who was most impacted, who wasn't impacted at all, who had enough cushion, even if they were impacted, to be able to bounce back and be able to feed others, and who was in this kind of supplication situation because of the impact. And similarly, when I went outside at that same place, outside they were having a town hall meeting, and on the stage were all the people who had the information, who had the resources, who had the decision-making power, FEMA, Red Cross, local government, down to a person, white, largely male, then lined up at the mic at that moment, getting that information, needing the resources, needing the services, down to a person, African American, down to a person, female, which also struck me because when I went back in, most of the people who were in line getting the food were the males, while the women were out there taking care of business. But that's a whole nother presentation altogether. So then when we talk about the infrastructure after Hurricane Isaac that really overtook Plaquemines Parish, just like Ida did this last time as well. CNN asked the person who was the congressional representative for that area why it was that Plaquemines Parish was inundated when 7 years before they started the levee reconstruction work. And so why wasn't it protected by the levee system? And she said she asked the Army Corps of Engineers the same question, and they said that they have a formula to determine which levees would be prioritized for fortification. And the formula gives points to each levee based on what the economic impact would be if the levee was overtaken. And so again, it's all about the money, and so the economic impact is based on property values, and the people with the lowest property values by definition then get the lowest amount of protection. There's the book by Bob Bullard that says The Wrong Complexion for Protection. And there's another book that was written by an economist called Weapons of Math Destruction, how kind of everyday formulas actually reinforce inequality in our systems. And this is just definitely one of them, how property values govern so much. And it results in kind of the people who are most vulnerable continuing to be most vulnerable and most impacted. So as we think about intersections, other intersections, we've already surfaced so many. Another is around the gender justice as well, where we know that where these gas and pipeline operations are, the man camps, what they call man camps, which are camps where the men come from wherever they live, and they live there while they work the rigs, these extraction rigs for the oil fields and so forth. And around these man camps, what develops is these predator economies, as they call them, again, this kind of extractive economy on steroids, where these predator economies result in trafficking of drugs and trafficking of people. This is where you see the proliferation of missing and murdered indigenous women. And this is they did a scene. I would invite people to listen to watch the CNN did this. Lisa Ling did a special on this a few years ago. Actually, coincidentally, I was actually in South Dakota for a meeting on the extreme extractive energy summit. And Lisa Ling was doing this special on this very predator economy around these man camps while I was there. So that was a huge coincidence, but also a very sobering connection to be made in real time. So, and I'm going to, so the other intersection, of course, is around racial justice has been a theme throughout. So we see like this whole situation where Black folks are being racially profiled just for doing regular things that anyone else does. Whether it's a Black Yale student who fell asleep and had the police called on him, the men in the Starbucks who had the police called on them, the people who were doing the Airbnb situation who had the police called on them. I have my many stories around these same things in my own life. And then we see where even after Hurricane Katrina, we had two people, the same story, same situation, but told in very different ways. And we see how narrative is prologue to what happens. And on the same day where it said white people, 2 residents wade through chesty floodwaters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. And so in this kind of caption is about white people just finding, they're just out there trying to survive. So they found this bread and soda that was on the shelves of the store. Whereas here, where it's an African-American male, it's a young man who walks through chesty floodwaters after looting a grocery store. Same activity, same premise, everything, but he's looting, they're just finding. And so again, that narrative, there becomes prologue to criminalization of Black men, and then comes the prologue to what happened in terms of these Black families that were just trying to find their neighbors or find food, and they were on the Danziger Bridge. Someone called in and said they were up to no good. Police showed up, killed unarmed Black families that were just trying to do whatever they were doing to find family, find food. And so they were they pled guilty because, again, and it's that combination, racial profiling plus criminalization. In this case was an instant death sentence without any deliberation or right to due process of any sort. So this is where you see the call for Black lives to matter. And so I am going to, I'm gonna kind of move us along to solutions a little bit quicker, because I want to end on a note of what we can actually do about this. But part of the reason that we kind of really go deep on these things is because we want to make sure people understand that it's not that we're talking about a broken system. We're talking about a system that's doing exactly what it was designed to do. And it's extractive economy by definition of how it's been set up. So it's not a situation where you can do a little reforming here, a little tweaking there, because it is so ingrained and the impacts are so pervasive and deep and historic and institutionalized. And so we really do need a revolution of our systems to be able to see justice and liberation, and a situation where people are actually not only just surviving by barely having the commons, but actually thriving, as we all have the ability, the capacity, and the right to do in this land and world and ecosystem of abundance. And so this last thing, I've been doing a lot of work. The reason I'm in Costa Rica, in fact, is because I'm doing this immersion Spanish class, because I am doing work around border and immigration issues, and see all of this is just inextricably interconnected. And one of the communities that I went to before I came here that I've been working in for the last few years is Laredo, Texas, where I'm talking to the different people there in this area where, ICE is constantly dropping off busloads of people who only have the clothes on their backs in terms of material goods, and some have been trafficked, others have experienced other trauma and so forth. But many of them are coming over because of their lands being ravaged by drought or otherwise, and having to migrate because there's no choice. Sorry, I'm at the school now, so that was the school bell ringing. So this notion of kind of people coming to take from our communities, which is often kind of the narrative around immigration, when really the US is 4% of the global population, but 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. So between the fact that we're responsible for the drought and responsible for the challenges they have, not to mention some of our imperial practices and so forth that are messing with the global economy and what's happening in these various communities. So we should really be thinking about refuge, sanctuary, open arms, as opposed to then putting people in cages when they come just seeking to survive. This quote from Warsan Shire, a Kenyan-born Somali poet: "You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." So as we think about solutions, another quote from Martin Luther King: "All progress is precarious, and the solution of one problem brings us face to face with another problem." We have to remember that we can't go with market-based solutions that really kind of are still based on this extractive economy. We can't, be kind of clear cutting our lands and trying to grow corn for fuel and these kinds of false solutions. We can't talk about a $7 billion challenge as meaning that we need to kind of start to what do you call it, cull the herd and so forth. And because usually when we're talking about these kind of population-based solutions, they're trying to do it with BIPOC communities and nations. When in fact, when someone kind of brought this up at a board meeting that I was at this funder, he said, "Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, population." And so my response was, okay, yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about the US being 4% of the population, of the global population, 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. So if we're talking about population control, if we just lop the US off of the planet, then everybody else will be much better off. And so let's not kind of have false solutions around having Black and brown folks producing less babies, which is where he was getting to. And let's talk about the fact that there is abundance, there is enough, but it's the excesses of the wealthy few that's causing the problem. So that, of course, was that conversation went south fast, but that, again, it's another presentation. So again, false solutions like clean coal, natural gas, that's causing everything from earthquakes, water contamination, home explosions, and so forth. And then even as we try to kind of develop new systems, we have them, like even with this notion of opportunity zones and some of these economic vehicles, often they are built on an extractive mindset. So it's still trying to benefit the developers. And so we have communities that end up with gentrification and displacement, as opposed to, even with climate action plans, if we're not doing them right, then we're perpetuating the same systems that got us in this situation in the first place. And so we know the kind of power and money that's influencing us to where we are, people who are claiming that climate change isn't happening, even though the evidence is staring us right in the face. Another quote from Martin Luther King: "Law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and when they fail this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress." And so we have kind of the stomping on democracy in these conversations we've been hearing about voting rights. We have a situation where Halliburton is seeking an exception from the Safe Water Drinking Act. The fact that there's even a form you can fill out to say, I'd like to be exempted from the regulations of the Safe Water Drinking Act, is a very bad sign. And so it's another video I would have shown you, but we're reaching the end of time. And so I want to just end with this kind of what upholding the beloved community and advancing human rights really looks like. Changing our systems, moving us away from an extractive economy to a living economy, eliminating poverty, racism, gender injustice, advancing LGBTQI justice, having an affirming and being in right relationship with each other. Making sure that we're seeing these intersections, that voting rights is totally tied to clean energy, that reversing this notion of corporate personhood is critical to us actually having a true democracy, that public participation, not only in the elections for president or Congress, but also for the city council, the school boards and so forth, is all part of this building of a true democracy. As we do that, we start to see the thriving communities that have like this inclusive democracy. Another quote from Martin Luther King: "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed." And we've seen where that is happening. And people are standing up, and we're seeing the results of it. Even at the UN climate talks, we're seeing the advancement of people coming together and pushing for the right decisions. This is the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, fighting for the rights of sub-Saharan African nations. We're seeing success with the Bank of America withdrawing funding for coal after this campaign, funding coal, killing communities. I showed this And NAACP was partnering with Bank of America. And so when I was showing this at one of the presentations, they called up our econ department. They're like, your colleague is, and so the econ department called me and I said, well, you know, once they stop funding coal and killing communities, I'll take the slide out of the presentation. So now the good thing is I can show the slide and have it be a success story that they did yield to the pressure and they are no longer funding coal and killing communities, at least not that way. So all the different ways that we are advancing with intersectional work, immigration rights, gender justice, engaging around the Black Lives Matter movement is integral to this work. This is actually at the UN Climate Talks, where we did a Black Lives Matter action there to really help to make sure those intersections were understood. This was actually in France, and it was right after the Charlie Hebdo tragedy that happened there. And so when the kids had stayed up all night, youth had stayed up all night making these signs, when they got to the center, they said, oh, you can't bring those signs in. We have strict, rules against this after this, this terrorist situation that happened. And so they were all upset and they called me while I was on the metro. So they couldn't communicate because it was in French. And so I got there and I was able to speak in French and they were like, well, we can't read these signs. We don't know what they say. They could be like citing insurrection or whatever. So then I said, oh no, they just say, we need more ambition or, whatever. Meanwhile, a couple of them said, F the police, so it was all kind of very dramatic, but we managed to get the signs in with a little bit of lying and a lot of negotiation and very broken French. So, faith leaders calling for the American, Petroleum Institute to stop wrecking the planet with their dirty fossil fuels. Faith leaders calling out climate change as a moral issue. Success in banning fracking in Maryland, thanks to the work of this awesome coalition. People who are reclaiming the grid and solar and Franklin, what's it called? Highland Park in Michigan, getting their own water energy supply to their street lights. In places like in the Western region, they're now moving this power without pollution, energy without injustice, and bringing more power to the very communities we were talking about at the beginning of the places like Grid Alternatives, training women to do rooftop solar installation, and people advancing a local food movement from Minneapolis to Kibera in Kenya to this community. Another video I would have shown you, which is really awesome. The kids are talking about growing our own food. Even improving our educational systems through green schools is not only better for the environment, but actually helps with school improvement, reduces teacher attrition, improves student attendance, and so forth. And so even transitioning from our waste systems from dig, burn, dump to recycling not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but also creates jobs and costs less. Of course, shifting transportation to mass transit away from this kind of the single car usage. The folks in LA had this mantra, 1,000 more buses, 1,000 less police. And then, of course, making sure that we have affordable, equitable, sustainable housing for all. Again, it's possible. It's not, we have to move away from the scarcity mentality. And then this kind of water for life, recognizing that water is a human right. So that whether it's the Keystone XL pipeline and others, really holding water as sacred and critical and abundant. And the Flint community is saying the same thing. And then, of course, just wages and a living wage, livelihoods, and so forth. And finally, with making sure that we have kind of social cohesion. It's, people call it soft, but it's also essential. And so I'll end with kind of the battle of the narrative. I talked before about the narrative prologue that results in racial profiling, criminalization, and unfortunately, the death of communities. Same with this notion of job-killing regulations as opposed to health-affirming regulations and so forth. So there's a quote, African proverb, until lions write their own history, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. and Saturday Night Live, when in its heyday, when it was funnier, but they had this weekend update where they said, it was a skit, one weekend update, where they were talking about kind of this fake news story. And it said, as told in the local newspaper, Hunter, thinking deer was dead, was injured as the deer jumped up and gored him. And so in the local newspaper, it was deer attacks Hunter. But then they said, or as the story was told in the deer community, serial killer injured as victim fights back. So it is really all about the narrative and who is telling the story, and importance of frontline communities telling their own story. So, and again, this is the importance of frontline community leadership around narrative, around coming up with the solutions and so forth. So these are all the principles of environmental and climate justice, democratic organizing through the HEMES principles. Another video I would have shown you, really highly recommend this, and we'll make sure you get all of this, but Dear Matafele Pinam from the sister Kathy from the Marshall Islands. It's a poem she wrote to her baby. Totally adorable, very visionary. And so ending with a quote from Martin Luther King, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And then this is just kind of a list of some of the things that we can do. And I'll give you the link to that as well, from educational sessions, healing walks, community cleanups, as universities partnering with frontline community groups and offering your expertise or just your labor to those communities' leadership to advance them and what they're doing, and starting things like clean air ordinances and zero waste, green schools, green campuses, community-owned solar co-ops, and so forth and so on. Again, we'll make sure you get that copy, and just recognizing that through doing all this, by everybody just doing something, that collective rolls up into major transformation if we do it strategically. And then, of course, a quote from Ben and Jerry's Peace, Love, and Ice Cream. And then ending with a quote from Martin Luther King, we have before us the glorious opportunity to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of our civilization. So thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for sharing all of that information and some of the grassroots or community work you've been doing to make change. At this time, we would invite questions or comments from people. I will read out of the chat, Carmen, and if someone raises their hand, you want to watch for that. So Jackie, the first one we have here from Emma says, currently, just nationally, we are all guaranteed the pursuit of happiness, but not happiness itself. We must, as a whole, work to provide happiness for all through equality, not excess. Thank you for the presentation and continual hard work for the betterment of our world. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. So thank you for that.
And feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to speak up.
I just want to say thank you. My name is Roxanne. I'm in North Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I feel like I've seen you before, talked with you, but I don't know for sure. But thank you. That's all.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, and I've been to Minneapolis, North Minneapolis specifically, many times. So I'm sure we have connected. So feel free to reach out if you want to connect again.
Thank you.
I think a lot of people might be like me. I mean, there was a lot of really excellent information in things that you're working on doing, that it's kind of just processing everything that we just learned in this last hour. Maybe some of it wasn't new, but a lot of it was, those of us that have never lived in those communities, it was really valuable information to see what we can do to help and be a voice.
Thank you.
Brandon typed in a question here. You talked about the transition away from an extractive system towards one focused on community. What are some of the ways you would like to see this happen?
Yeah, so one is thinking about each of our systems in ways that we can have localized systems that are, so for example, and by the end, when we talk about solutions, I was going so fast, I wasn't sure how much time. So moving us towards having microgrids instead of having just this centralized fossil fuel based energy, which is again based on this extractive notion of creating energy as cheaply as possible, centralized and owned by companies that are, investor-owned utility companies that are owning and profiting from the energy system. Instead, if we can start generating our own energy through investing more in energy efficiency, developing, community-owned microgrid, then we can start to make that shift in that system. Another system is our food system. Then we talked about Monsanto and some of the big food and big that combined animal feeding operations and so forth, that if we think about like growing community by community, starting to grow our own food, whether it is, if we have clean soil, which unfortunately too many of our communities don't, but we have clean soil going in the ground, raised bed gardens if we don't, aquaponics, we're starting to look at aquaponics. And so the more we grow our own food and the more we start to patronize local producers of food as well, in addition to growing our own, and our, like that combination of just, again, shifting away. And it's not only kind of moving away from CAFOs and groups like Monsanto with the single cycle seeds, but also it takes us away from the shipping and trucking of food, which also is polluting as well. So like just thinking about each and every one of our systems, how we can have more localized systems, more community owned and community controlled systems, we can start to move away from an economy where it's, all the wealth and power and control is held by a wealthy few. So those are just a few examples, more, but thank you.
Leela says, the talking points were not new, but many of the numerous examples were new to me. Thank you for sharing them. It's easy to get numb. Your presentation served as a reminder of the people affected by discriminatory policies.
Thank you.
And then Carly, on that note, I think has a question. Do you have any recommendations of media sources that you follow, or perhaps books that you think everyone would find impactful to read? And maybe you could share those and we could post those along with your presentation if you have some resources you'd like to.
Yeah, definitely.
Share.
I can send some along. And for now, definitely Yes Magazine, for example, has a lot of insightful, thoughtful pieces around these very topics, for sure. There is a book I wrote a chapter in recently called All We Can Save, that it's an anthology of different women leading on climate, and so it's interesting, kind of relatable, because people are telling their personal stories, but within it, lessons that they've learned along the way. So that would be another possibility. And then there's a, I'm trying to remember, just blanked on her name. Yeah, I will have to follow up with some more recommendations as well, but yeah, those are a couple.
Okay. Any last questions? Oh, here's one from Andrew. How can we incentivize the people in charge of our institutions to commit to change? That's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on which institutions we're talking about, but some institutions it will require some. It will require, leveraging of power, and then pushing for change in that way, because some won't be reasoned into changing, or otherwise they will require a little bit more. There's somewhere, yes, if you have a series of consultations, then and present them with not only ideas but resources for how they can change, then we can see some progress. Like there's municipalities that I've spoken to where it's like, yeah, that's all well and good, but where's the money to do that? And then I can say, well, here's a couple of resources, and then they're willing to change, if there's resources to do it. And that's true with many institutions. Meeting people where they are and finding out what they want. So some institutions where they love the idea of being the first or being able to do something that's different, that's gonna get media for them and get them praised for doing something. So sometimes it's about that. And so those are kind of some of the positive ways to get folks to change. And then it gets to like some of the naming and shaming, like just like what we did, funding coal, killing communities, and then really doing days of action where we got everybody to not use their ATM cards that day so that they didn't have those fees that they rack up from those uses of those ATMs. So, that's a way that we changed the whole corporation between like a heavy media action, hitting them in the pocket and getting them to change that way. Some other institutions, similar tactics might be necessary. If we can't get them to do the carrot, then definitely a stick might be necessary. Yeah, a stick with a little bit of honey on the end. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see any more coming in. So thank you again, Jackie. This was really great and a great way to kick off our week with a lot of references back to Martin Luther King. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Jackie. We really appreciate you kicking off our week this week.
Wonderful. Thank you. Wishing you the best with the rest. Thank you for having me.